Hello and welcome to Science in Context. Today we're going to be talking about memory. It's actually a topic that we've been putting off for a while and then we chose it last weekend, and then in the meantime, we came across this crazy week in politics last week where there was a lot of testifying around someone's memory of a specific event and of course, the Kavanaugh, Dr. Blasey Ford hearing. So we thought it was kind of perfect timing for us to talk a little bit about memory, and we'll focus in on how trauma and alcohol both affect different brain systems and how that impacts your memory. So, Mike, why don't we get right into it? Do you want to give us a little bit of background on memory?
Yeah, I do, Kevin. How did you know? Memory is really interesting. It's also super confusing. It seems like there's just like the general disclaimer about from everything I've read is that, well, memory technically involves the whole brain, but there are some parts that are more important than others. And that kind of goes through every single part of memory. But there's let's just go to it. There's about two different, there's three that we'll go over types of memory. Two of them are long-term memory, one's a short-term memory. And we'll start with the most obvious one. It's called explicit memory. Sometimes you can hear it called declarative memory. Essentially, that is the memory that you consciously use when someone asks you questions like, what did you eat for lunch? And then you think, it's like, oh, I had a burrito. And that's the process of you recalling and thinking about it is this declarative memory. And so most of the information, it seems like, is stored in the prefrontal cortex, which is a confusing and really interesting area, as we kind of just said right before. But could you give us the spark notes maybe of what the prefrontal cortex is, or where it is?
Yeah. So it's kind of where it sounds like it's up front in your brain, and when I say front, I mean behind your forehead. And it has to do with or the functions that it deals with are complex and social behaviors, as well as kind of your personality and your decision making. And so it's really even just those topics kind of make you understand how it's a really confusing part of the brain that there's a lot going on. It's obviously covering social behavior, which is not only weird within a single person, but then there are different cultures that have different social norms. And so that area of the brain just has a lot of broad impacts. Obviously, on top of that, everyone on Earth has a different personality, and everyone makes decisions in a different way. So the things that the prefrontal cortex covers and deals with can be different in every person, different across societies. So super interesting topic that Mike was saying before the show. We could maybe devote a whole episode just to the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, I kind of do. Even reading about it, it's involved in this thing called autonoetic consciousness. We won't really need to get into now, but it kind of, it's very, it's kind of something that evolutionarily happened late, just in the timeline that we have, and it's very different than other animals. So yeah, it's really interesting, but it's a big part of memory. Another part is the hippocampus. That is more involved in mediating recording of memories and kind of getting them into long-term memory. There's this classic patient called HM who had a damaged hippocampus. I think it was from a surgery, which is pretty terrible. And he no longer was able to form long-term memories, but he had all of his old memories. So that's how people kind of figured out that it's not involved in the actual storage of it, but transferring somehow from information you are learning in short-term memory into long-term memory. But could you give us a little rundown of anything else about the hippocampus that I missed?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hippocampus, besides being involved in memory and emotion, something that happens to it when you're stressed is it can shrink, can lose volume. So I'll refer back to that later when we talk a little bit more about trauma. But when that happens in the hippocampus, that can result in damage, such as what you were just talking about with the patient who lost his or her ability to form short-term memories. So yeah, hippocampus, definitely the key aspect of it is that it can be damaged, and it has impact when it is damaged.
Yeah, so I guess that's about basically the spark notes of the explicit memory and long-term memory, or the conscious memory, I guess we could call it. We have another type of memory called implicit memory. This is more involved in when you're learning a skill. Say you're learning how to ride a bike, play the guitar. You don't at least Kevin and I play the guitar, so we kind of know that, after you learn a bunch of scales, and at least for me, whenever I learn a song, I never think, this is the next chord, this is the next note. I just do it. And that's implicit memory. I don't know if it's the same way with you, Kevin, but it's it's kind of just something that you intuitively do without conscious thought.
Yeah,
and it's like,
something you can associate. Sorry to interrupt. Something
oh
you
yeah,
can associate with it is like muscle memory. So, yeah, guitar is a really good example. The phrase like riding a bike kind of comes from that sort of feeling, and even something like practicing like your jump shot on a basketball court. It's all kind of falls under this repetitive motion that your body doesn't need to think about anymore consciously. It's just something that you do.
yeah, it's like any sport, honestly. Like whether you're learning to jab with boxing or serve in tennis, you're using this muscle memory or implicit memory that you're developing just through practice and practice and practice. So you don't have to think about how to do it. Your body knows how to do it. And it's not like super well known exactly how implicit memory works. The interesting thing is it's separate from explicit memory. So there have been people have done studies with people with amnesia where they can't form long-term memories, but they are able to like improve on tasks that have implicit memory. So you actually can have like these are things that are like separate. It's kind of interesting, even though there's not a ton known about it. And there's this really interesting thing I kind of stumbled upon while I was doing some research. It's called the illusion of truth effect. Have you heard of this, Kevin?
I think I read where you're getting this from also yesterday, but go ahead and remind me exactly where you're going.
Well, it's actually well studied. Recently, I'll just go over this study because it's kind of interesting. But in 2012, some participants were exposed to false news stories. It sounds kind of familiar. And it happened in 2012, though, so they did it before it was popular.
Yeah.
And they found that a significant fraction of people would go on to have false memories. And essentially, the repetitive false claims increased believability. So this really just suggests that people are more likely to rate like statements that they've previously heard as true, regardless if they are truthful or not. Even if they know they're not truthful, they're more likely to kind of just believe that this is true. Which when I was reading that, I was like, oh wow, this sounds pretty familiar.
Yeah, familiar and dangerous.
Yeah. So this actually is just an effect that people believe is kind of the side effect of implicit memory, where your brain's hearing things, your brain's trying to pick up on patterns, and whether it's good or not, right? You kind of just implicitly pick up on like thinking that some of these things that you just keep on hearing are true, which kind of explains why sometimes you hear, like this is how like I guess propaganda kind of works. Not like all the time, obviously, but if you just repeat the same thing, people kind of intuitively but just start to believe it, which I thought was super interesting. But
yeah,
again, not much is really known about implicit memory. It's not like at least neurochemistry. It's a little confusing. But we might as well just take a trip down to the working memory. This is just the last main type of memory. And it's super interesting as well, and also very complicated, also not well known. Just the human brain, it turns out, is like really complicated. It turns out people don't really know exactly how it works, but we have like some decent ideas. Working memory, I think, is really the most complicated of all the memories. It is doing a lot of things. It's sometimes called short-term memory. Sometimes people want to distinguish between short-term memory and working memory, because working memory, apart from just being like the short-term storage of like numbers or whatever you're doing, it also somehow coordinates with your long-term memory to help store memories and make sure that they're stable. But it also is just like working. It's like the memory that allows you to know where you are, what you've been doing, and like kind of be aware of your surroundings. So it's also super important. There's some interesting studies, or at least correlations, people have found that working memory is actually a better predictor of academic success in children than IQ is. And just low working memory scores on like different tests people have are just associated with low learning outcomes. So it's actually just very important to being able to learn, actually. Kind of just, I guess the general way of saying it is it kind of serves as an encoding and retrieving like system where it helps encode these memories and make them stable, and long-term storage also helps retrieve them. So it's just like super, super important. People believe it's mostly the prefrontal cortex is involved in this. And the prefrontal cortex, they think basically is in charge of like attention and like kind of manipulating like where like you pay attention and like retrieving specific memories for the right occasion, and like all sorts of things like that. And just another actually interesting thing is there's affective stress, which I believe you'll talk more about, but it also has an effect on working memory and the prefrontal cortex as well, as it just affected negatively by acute and chronic psychological stress. But I mean, I think that's just about it. That's just a quick rundown. It's really weird, really interesting. But that's just how working memory works. And it's actually one last thing. I want to quickly mention this MIT study about how people think the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex kind of work together in tandem just to make memories. So as I mentioned, that we don't really know exactly how memories are formed, but these people at MIT were able, it's actually studying rats, so not like super, super relevant, but it's a good model. And they were able to see that basically when the rats were trying to form new memories and transfer them into long-term memory, that both the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex were like lighting up in these experiments. And it kind of suggests that for somehow that both of these parts of the brain are very important into transferring memories into long-term memory, where at first people thought it was like just in the hippocampus and then get like transferred to the prefrontal cortex at some point somehow. This research kind of suggests that they're formed parallel, meaning at the same time in two different places. And then as time goes on, one of them kind of just fades away, which is kind of interesting. There's still not much known. It's just one study. But I thought it was just kind of interesting point of how people are trying to figure out how this working memory works.
So now that we've kind of given a rundown of how memory works and where it lights up in the brain and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, we want to talk a little bit more specifically about memory and how it's affected by trauma or how it's affected by alcohol, which were two themes of that hearing last week in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So, of course, the quick version of the story is that this woman, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, came forward and said she was sexually assaulted about 30 years ago by Supreme Court nominee Bret Kavanaugh. And so one of the many storylines that came out of this was how much can we trust a memory that's 30 years old? And on top of that, how does this traumatic event affect someone's memory? And so obviously in the wake of all of this, there was plenty of speculation about trauma, and there was an interview between NPR's Ari Shapiro and this psychology professor from Harvard named Richard McNally. And so some of the kind of big points that they made in this interview was that, first of all, memory is not a videotape. So as much as we want to trust our memory, it's not like a document. It's not like it's not like your brain is filming what you're seeing every day, and that more memorable things are just better, higher quality films with better audio or anything like that. Really, it's the impressions that are left on you. And without getting too much into the weeds with it, when you form a memory, your brain is sort of forming these electrical connections with the synapses in the brain. And so essentially they're electrical impulses, and they're not the same as a videotape. So I feel like that's an important thing to emphasize.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because like eyewitness testimony in cases on trial is like not very relevant to. This is not a strong piece of evidence just because people have found out this, like, well, memories are not super trustworthy and different people could see the same thing and give different stories.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of point the listeners to two really cool podcasts about memory that I've heard. One of them, both of them are Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. One of them is called A Polite Word for Liar. The other one's called Free Brian Williams. The Brian Williams one is a little bit more well-known. Brian Williams was an anchor for, I want to say NBC News. I'm actually not positive there. But he told the story that he was part of a helicopter mission in the Middle East, and the helicopter that he was in was being shot at. It turns out that he was not in that helicopter. He was in a different helicopter that was miles away from where this shooting was happening. And so he misremembered this event, but people were saying that he was trying to claim some kind of false glory. And really it's just kind of a case study in the fallibility of human memory. So it's really interesting. I don't want to talk too much about it, especially because it's been a while since I've listened to it, but it is relevant. And it's a really good podcast. And overall, that's specifically a good episode and relative to what we're talking about. So anyway, back to what trauma does to memory. So this Professor McNally from Harvard was saying that during a traumatic event, the vivid central features are particularly memorable, whereas things that happen on the peripheral are not so well remembered. So whatever it was that made you feel threatened is much more memorable because your brain is kind of focused on this thing that's threatening you, threatening your safety. And later, this can become a trigger for things like post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Whereas some of the unnecessary details, like the color of the walls or what day it was or things like that, your brain doesn't really take note of those so much because they're not, during this event, they're not vital to your survival. And so these memories are actually, what memories you do form are very stable. So they surveyed war veterans, assault victims, natural disaster victims, and the central features of the events are extremely memorable and pretty stable across even like over time, over several decades. So in a little bit more of a sense of what the body is doing when these events are happening is your body releases a number of stress hormones, and two of the main ones are cortisol and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is released from the adrenal gland, and so the word adrenal spelled very similar to adrenaline for good reason. Norepinephrine follows a pathway that kind of turns it into adrenaline, or it does has the same effect as adrenaline, where your heart rate increases, your blood pressure rises, and it's essentially a mechanism where your body supplies more energy for itself. So it's very associated with fight or flight mode, if that's something familiar to the audience, where your body thinks that in order to survive, it either has to fight some kind of threat or flee from this threat, so hence fight or flight. And then cortisol is a steroidal hormone. When it's released, it increases your body's glucose production, so it actually has some impact in diabetes as well. But in the case of someone who's under some kind of stressful event, it increases your metabolism. So again, kind of plays in that fight or flight, increases your body's capacity to produce energy and to use energy. And so overall, the net effect of these hormones being released and the stressful event happening to you is you have this sharp focus on whatever's threatening you, and the peripheral details are not as intense and memorable. So I like to kind of give this example. It's not quite as stressful. I guess it can be. If you trip and fall in front of a bunch of people, you're going to remember what you tripped on, maybe where you were, but not necessarily what the day of the week was or exactly all the people that were there. You might remember a couple, like if your crush was there, maybe you'd remember that, but you might not remember all the other people that were there. So the things that threaten you or threaten your happiness or well-being are the things that stick out to you. So you embarrassed yourself in front of your crush. That's memorable. But was it a Tuesday or a Wednesday? That might not be as important.
Yeah, this is kind of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like similar to flashbulb memories, where it's the term for just like these very vivid recollections you have just because of there's something like very emotional or just a huge point in your life or something like that, where it feels like you can kind of recall every detail, even though this is a little bit different, I guess, because the details are just like as normal as a normal memory, so they're not like super reliable, but it feels very, very vivid.
Well, I think that's accurate. I think
is that exactly what you're saying?
That you said is yeah. So like details, some details you might remember incorrectly, and that's actually what a little bit of what the first Malcolm Gladwell podcast that I mentioned talks about is two people were both at this highly stressful emotional event. I think there's like a shooting or something like that. I probably should have listened to this podcast before I started talking about it. Anyway, they both were there. They were both in the room. And they remember the event about the same, but the details surrounding the event, they have totally different details that they narrate this event with. Even though they were both there and they were both friends and they both agreed that both of them were there, they just have all these different peripherals that are completely foreign from one another. So it's true that the flashbulb part, if something intense and emotional happens, you remember that part. But the things on the outside of the flashbulb, I mean, if someone shines a flashbulb in your eye, you see the flash, but you might not be able to see the things surrounding the flash because you're blinded by it. I guess that's the kind of analogy I would give.
Okay. So this is kind of how stress or just like a very emotional, something that's a big deal affects your memory. So how do other things affect our memory? Maybe substances, for example.
Oh, so you want to get right into alcohol already, huh?
It's the good stuff. I mean, we can always get to it a little bit later if you want.
Right. let me hold off on alcohol. I know it's I know it's tempting, but no, we'll get to it. I promise. There are a couple other things I wanted to mention about trauma before we get there. So one other part of the brain that I want to bring up is called the amygdala, and it's part of your fear stress response pathway. And something about the amygdala that's super important is that it's part of your subconscious brain. So the nice thing about your subconscious brain is it gets to what it's doing very quickly. It doesn't have to wait for your conscious brain to sequentially make logical steps. So the example that I read about in a book called Nerve by Taylor Clark, which is super interesting, it talks a lot about fear and stress and overcoming those things, and what you're just literally biologically not able to overcome. But as far as your amygdala, it happens so quickly that if something, say you're at the zoo and there's 6-foot glass between you and a tiger, but if that tiger jumps at that glass, you're going to jump, you're going to flinch, and that's because your amygdala sees this threat coming at you so quickly, and it forces your body to react before your conscious brain can say, there's 6 feet of glass between me and this tiger, I'm going to be fine. So obviously nowadays you're not going to run into a lot of tigers where you're going to need that quick of a biological response, but it comes from evolution, from human evolution. So 2,000 years ago, if you're walking through the jungle and you're out of the corner of your eye, you see something in the trees, if you take the time to think, okay, I saw something in the trees, what color was it? Was it orange? Does that mean it's necessarily a tiger? You're already dead by the time you think all those things. So evolutionarily speaking, you want something very quick to happen. You want to flinch quickly, jump, dive into a cover, whatever you need to do to survive. And so the people with quicker reaction times survive more quickly, and that led to this subconscious fear response being part of human evolution. So
yeah, it's part of the implicit memory, as we were talking about before.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the amygdala, it's all very interesting how it's all tied together, where the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are more part of your conscious brain. So if we circle all this back to trauma, obviously trauma is going to trigger your amygdala, but what it also does is it diminishes the volume of your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex. So you can think of that as your memory shrinks down a little bit. That's kind of a simplistic way of thinking about it, but your ability to form and process memory shrinks a little bit. But what that kind of does, if you think about it like a camera kind of zooming its lens, so there's a narrower amount of things that you're seeing, but at the same time you're very focused and sharp on the one thing that you're focused on. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So a couple studies that I found interesting when I was researching here. There's a study where rat pups were picked up, taken away from their mothers for a minute, and then returned. So as they're picked up and taken from their mothers, this is obviously a stressful event for really young animals. So they freak out for a minute, and they put it back with their mom. The mom rat licks the pups to comfort them. And what this led to through the rat pups' lives as they grew up was almost a sort of inoculation to stress. So the control group of rats, this wasn't done to them, and then they compared the hippocampal damage to them later in life by other stressful events. And they found that the pups that were picked up and stressed when they were young actually resisted hippocampal damage later in their life. So I thought it was kind of interesting how these types of things can be adjusted. It's almost like a vaccine. And this can have really strong implications in things like childhood abuse and trauma, and further from that, the effects of aging as you get older, and how your brain reacts to stress as you get older based on how your brain was stressed when you were younger. So I just thought that was a really interesting study into kind of a direct result of trauma and how it affects the brain. Okay, so the moment we've all been waiting for. What does alcohol do to the brain? So alcohol, we're specifically kind of talking about like blackouts, right? That's when it's going to affect your memory. And so if you drink, as any college-age drinker knows, or someone who's been to college in the past 50, 60 years, or probably longer, if you drink a lot of alcohol, especially if you drink it quickly or on an empty stomach, you're liable to get a blackout. You're liable to get blackout drunk and lose your memory of that night. It's a really weird experience. You wake up the next day and there's just gaps in your memory. So they did this study where they interviewed college undergraduates. 51% of them reported, of the ones who drank, 51% reported that yes, they had blacked out before. 40% reported that it happened to them in the past year, and over 9.4% reported it happened to them in the past 2 weeks.
That's just really funny.
Yeah,
that's just a lot of people blacking out. It sounds right.
Exactly, it's common. It's extremely common. It happens. I mean, college. It depends on the college you go to, of course. Depends on your friend groups, but in cultures where drinking is very common in college, it's just something that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, especially when you're young, it's pretty easy just to drink too much,
right.
like way too much.
Yeah, I mean, there's even there's the argument that because the drinking age is 21 in America, where it's younger in other countries, that America is particularly susceptible to this because students get out to college and they have this freedom, and if they're able to obtain alcohol, they go a little more crazy with it. That's probably a separate subject. It doesn't really have to do with our topic of memory today. So anyway, bringing it back to memory. So kind of similar to stress, actually, the hippocampus volume decreases with, it's been associated with decreasing in especially in alcoholics. So one quick, like if you black out once, I don't think it's been necessarily shown the alcohol shrinks your hippocampus that one time you black out, but it is associated with if you drink a lot of alcohol over time that your memory, or your hippocampus at least, decreases in volume, which can affect your memory, as we talked about. And so it kind of makes sense. At first, I was kind of surprised how similar the effects of alcohol and trauma were on the brain and on memory. But at the end of the day, memory is memory. So if you're losing it, it probably has something to do with your hippocampus or your prefrontal cortex. And so it kind of makes sense that there's a similar brain-related result when it comes to what alcohol does and what trauma does. There is hope for alcoholics who don't want to lose their memory. Aminoacetic acid treatment actually is shown to kind of reverse the effects of any kind of cognitive impairment due to alcoholism. So it does this by reducing the hydrogen sulfide concentration in the brain, which correlates positively with alcoholism. So that was kind of an interesting study that I saw. Another thing that alcohol and nicotine do, it can have effect, because trauma is kind of associated with PTSD. Nicotine and alcohol can perturb the dopamine pathways, and dopamine helps maintain amygdala and prefrontal cortex function. So, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is released when your brain is happy, or when your body's happy, or when you're consciously happy. It's something that is released. So, all these different impacts that alcohol and trauma can have on the brain, and I mean, in excess, alcohol is generally not very good for the brain. Trauma almost never good for the brain. But you can see this in weird circumstances, such as the rat pups. The trauma actually helps them later in life. So there's probably something to going through hard times helps your brain kind of figure out how to deal with stress and become stronger for it at a later point.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And there must be some sort of like middle ground too, because as I was reading, I saw that there's, if you have like chronic stress, that can also be associated with lower, smaller prefrontal cortex and like less working memory. So it is interesting that there's probably a lot of nuance to this exact point, and exactly how memory works and how much is enough stress to kind of, work out your brain essentially.
Right. Yeah. So PTSD is associated with prefrontal cortex damage, and so some of the behaviors that are displayed by people with PTSD can kind of be explained by this area of the brain that's responsible for social behaviors and behaving in an acceptable way. That part of your brain is literally damaged, so it makes sense why PTSD might have a negative effect on your ability to kind of cope in society.
All right, that's about all the time we have today. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and have a great week.
Thank you.